My cheating wife texted me that she was stuck at work and wished me a happy 35th anniversary. But I was sitting 2 tables away in the same restaurant, watching her lean across the table and kiss her assistant. Just as I stood up to confront them, a strange woman grabbed my arm and whispered to stay calm because the real show was about to begin. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I built Caldwell Logistics from a single rusted truck into a billion-dollar empire. If you are watching this story right now, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a masterclass in betrayal from the person I trusted most in this world. If you connect with my story, please hit the like button to bring some support to this old man's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of this journey, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing where my listeners are tuning in from. I was sitting in the VIP shadow corner of Le Bernardin in Chicago. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. 35 years of marriage is no small milestone, especially in my world. When Victoria and I first met, I was hauling heavy cargo crates on the freezing, unforgiving docks of the city. I did not have a dime to my name, just a stubborn refusal to stay poor and a burning ambition to build something massive. I bought her wedding ring by selling my only reliable delivery truck, a sacrifice she swore she would never forget. She stood by me through the grueling early years when we ate canned soup in a drafty apartment and constantly worried about making rent. Over the decades, as my wealth grew, I made sure she never had to worry about anything ever again. I funded a massive charitable foundation just so she could have a project to call her own, pouring millions into it to keep her happy and fulfilled. I thought we had built an unbreakable bond, a partnership forged in the fires of our early struggles. Tonight, I had personally reserved this secluded, dimly lit booth to surprise her with a custom diamond necklace. I was nursing a glass of aged whiskey, occasionally checking my heavy gold watch. She was running late. That was not entirely unusual lately. Victoria took her role at the charity foundation very seriously, and she often claimed her board meetings ran long into the evening. But tonight was different. Tonight was our anniversary, a date we had sworn never to compromise on. My phone vibrated softly against the heavy mahogany table. I picked it up and saw a message from her. I am stuck at a charity board meeting. So sorry I am late for our 35th anniversary dinner, honey. Love you. I smiled, a soft, understanding smile of a husband who thought he knew his wife completely. I typed out a quick reply telling her not to worry, that the business was important, and that I would wait for her as long as it took. But as I set the phone down and looked up across the crowded, elegant dining room, the smile completely froze on my face. The lighting in my private corner was intentionally dim, designed for utmost privacy. But 2 tables away, directly under the warm, revealing glow of a massive crystal chandelier, sat a woman in a stunning silk dress. It was the exact emerald green dress I had bought for Victoria just last week. My eyes locked onto the back of her head, tracking the familiar curve of her neck, the way her hair was pinned up perfectly. I squinted, trying to make sense of the visual illusion playing tricks on my aging eyes. But it was not an illusion. It was Victoria. My wife of 3.5 decades was sitting right there in the same restaurant where we always celebrated our anniversary. But she was not alone. Sitting across from her, radiating youth and arrogant confidence, was Damian Pierce. Damian was 35 years old. He was the brilliant, ambitious hotshot I had personally discovered, mentored, and recently promoted to Chief Operating Officer of my entire logistics empire. I had treated that boy like the son I never had in the executive suite. I had trusted him with the ultimate keys to my corporate kingdom, sharing strategies and secrets I barely shared with my own board of directors. And there he was, casually pouring expensive red wine into my wife's glass. I watched in absolute paralyzed silence as Victoria laughed at something he said. It was not her polite, rehearsed corporate laugh. It was a deep, throaty, genuine sound I had not heard directed at me in years. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers gently tracing the edge of his hand. The absolute comfort and sickening intimacy between them was undeniable. Then right there in the open, amidst the clinking of fine crystal and the low murmur of wealthy patrons, she leaned her face across the pristine white tablecloth. Damien met her halfway. They kissed. It was not a friendly peck on the cheek or a polite greeting. It was passionate, hungry, and entirely practiced. It was the kiss of two people who had done this 100 times before in the shadows, two people who felt entirely invincible. The aged whiskey in my glass trembled violently as my knuckles turned completely white. My chest tightened with such agonizing force that I literally forgot how to breathe. 35 years. All the sacrifices, all the late nights building an empire so she could live like an absolute queen, and she was sitting 50 feet away, making a fool out of me with a man half my age. A man I paid a massive 7-figure salary to. The sheer audacity of choosing to do it at the very restaurant where we always celebrated our anniversary was a level of emotional cruelty I simply could not process. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, a sharp, twisting knife right in my gut. But then as quickly as the pain arrived, it evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, blinding, calculated rage. I am not a man who accepts defeat or humiliation. I did not conquer the cutthroat logistics industry by rolling over when attacked by rivals. I decided right then and there that I was going to end them both. I was going to stand up, walk straight over to that illuminated table, flip it onto the floor, and loudly destroy Damien's career and my marriage in front of Chicago's elite. I placed both of my trembling hands firmly on the edge of the table, bracing myself to rise and unleash hell upon them. Just as my weight shifted forward and I began to stand, a hand clamped down hard on my forearm. The grip was terrifyingly strong, completely unexpected, and it pinned me back against the leather seat. I jerked my head to the side, my heart hammering in my ears. Sliding into the dark booth beside me was an older woman I had never seen before in my life. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to read my soul, and iron-gray hair styled impeccably. I opened my mouth to aggressively demand who she was and what she thought she was doing, but she squeezed my arm even tighter, leaning in close so only I could hear her words over the restaurant noise. "Sit down, Harrison," she whispered, her voice colder and sharper than the ice in my glass. I stared at her, completely thrown off balance. How did this total stranger know my name? "A public scene only satisfies a fool's temper," she continued, not breaking eye contact for a single second. "If you walk over there right now, you will lose absolutely everything you have spent your entire life building. Sit still. Your wife's best performance has not even started yet." I demanded to know what she meant. She slid a white business card across the table. "Meet me tomorrow at 9, she said, rising from the booth. She vanished into the crowded restaurant, leaving me alone with a roaring silence. I stared at the card. Evelyn Sterling. No company name, just a phone number. My instinct, the sharp instinct that kept me alive in the brutal freight business, told me to listen to her. I forced my rapid breathing to slow down. I pushed the burning fury deep down into my stomach, locking it away. Anger is a liability. Strategy is the only salvation. I signaled the waiter, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I handed him my black card to settle the $800 bill for a dinner my wife never attended. As I sat waiting, my eyes drifted back to the lit table across the room. Damien was tracing the delicate rim of his wineglass, whispering something softly that made Victoria throw her head back in laughter. It was absolutely sickening to witness. When the waiter returned with the receipt, I signed it with a steady hand. Then I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my money clip. I did not leave it as a generous tip. Instead, my fingers began to fold the stiff paper, moving with a deep muscle memory that had been etched into my hands 4 decades ago. A sharp fold right here, a tight crease there, twisting the rigid currency until it formed the shape of a blooming rose. It was our most intimate secret code. Back when we were struggling and starving, when an unexpected medical bill meant we ate nothing but cheap noodles for a week. I could not afford real flowers for her 25th birthday. I had folded a single $1 bill into a small rose, holding her hands and promising her that one day I would give her an entire garden of them. She had cried deeply that night and kept that cheap paper rose sitting proudly on our bedroom nightstand for many long years. I stood up slowly from the private booth. I buttoned my custom-tailored suit jacket, smoothing out the fine fabric. I walked purposefully through the dining room, charting a deliberate path that took me directly behind the chairs where Damien and Victoria sat. They were far too engrossed in each other's glowing eyes to notice the rest of the world around them. As I passed silently right behind her chair, I casually dropped the $100 origami rose onto the white tablecloth, letting it land right next to her neglected cell phone. I did not pause my stride. I did not turn my head to look back at them. I walked straight out through the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant and into the cold night. The howling Chicago wind hit my face the moment I stepped onto the concrete pavement. It was a biting, unforgiving cold, but I welcomed the harsh sting. It instantly cleared the emotional fog of betrayal from my racing mind. I did not feel the slightest urge to weep. I did not lament my broken marriage, and I certainly did not look up at the dark sky to ask the universe why this was happening to me. Lamenting is a pathetic exercise reserved for weak victims, and I have never been a victim in my life. Instead, my mind abruptly shifted into a cold, mechanical, and ruthless state of strategic calculation. Walking steadily toward my waiting luxury car, the polished city concrete beneath my expensive shoes faded away, and I clearly remembered the rough, splintered, damp wood of the industrial city docks. I remembered being 30 years old, hauling massive cargo crates in the freezing rain until my bare hands bled freely and my lower back felt completely broken. I built Caldwell Logistics from nothing but raw sweat, bleeding knuckles, and a single rusted delivery truck that barely started in the harsh winter mornings. I personally faced down corrupt union bosses who tried everything in their power to bleed my small business dry. I stood my solid ground against the violent local mafia outfits that aggressively demanded weekly protection money just to let my delivery trucks cross the county line without catching on fire. I fought desperate men who carried loaded guns and wealthy men who carried leather briefcases, and I buried them all under the massive weight of my undeniable success. I had calmly stared down ruthless corporate sharks, actively trying to orchestrate hostile takeovers, and I crushed their entire careers without a single second thought. I built a global empire that moved millions of tons of heavy freight across the oceans. If I could survive the brutal, unforgiving underworld of the Chicago shipping industry, I could absolutely survive the treacherous, petty greed of my own wife. She mistakenly thought she was playing a clever game with an old, tired man. She had completely forgotten who built the massive kingdom she was currently enjoying. I climbed into the quiet back seat of my car. I instructed my driver to take me straight home. The long ride through the busy city was entirely silent. I silently watched the bright city lights blur past the dark-tinted windows, my sharp brain meticulously dissecting every single interaction I had shared with Victoria and Damien over the past 6 months. The late evening meetings she claimed to have, the sudden massive corporate budget approvals I had blindly signed off on. Damien holding an incredibly rapid, unexplained rise to the highest executive position, a promotion that was heavily advocated for and relentlessly pushed by Victoria herself. They had played me perfectly, like a blind old fool. They had used my unconditional trust as a sharp weapon against me. We arrived at the imposing iron gates of my private estate. The house was a sprawling, silent fortress. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, completely ignoring the priceless artwork and the shining marble floors. None of it meant anything to me right now. I went straight down the hall to my private study, deliberately leaving the bright overhead lights completely turned off. The room was cloaked in heavy, suffocating shadows. I sat in my leather chair behind the oak desk facing the closed double doors. I poured a generous measure of aged scotch, not to drink, but to hold something grounding. The grandfather clock ticked methodically. It was exactly midnight. I sat perfectly still in absolute darkness for an hour, letting the silence sharpen my senses. Every single tick was a painful reminder of wasted trust. My mind ran through various scenarios to completely dismantle Damien, but Evelyn loudly echoed in my head. I needed to see Victoria spin her web tonight. At exactly 1 a.m, the metallic click of the front door loudly echoed. I heard the clumsy thud of her designer heels. She cautiously pushed the study door open slightly. The suffocating scent of expensive men's cologne and stale red wine immediately hit me. In her hand, dangling loosely, was a cheap, wrinkled gift bag. I remained perfectly still in the leather chair, letting the suffocating scent of cheap men's cologne and stale wine wash over me as Victoria stepped into my private study. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, rubbing her temples, as if she carried the absolute weight of the world on her shoulders. Her performance was remarkably practiced. If I had not seen her passionately kissing my 35-year-old chief operating officer just hours earlier, I might have actually believed the sheer exhaustion etched onto her beautifully preserved face. She walked slowly toward my desk, her heels sinking softly into the thick Persian rug. "I am so sorry I missed our special dinner, Harrison," she murmured, her voice dripping with manufactured regret. The charity board meeting was an absolute nightmare. The financial audits ran late into the evening, and we could not leave until every single budget line was thoroughly reviewed and properly approved. "You know how seriously I take the foundation work you entrusted to me." I simply nodded, keeping my facial expression completely void of any readable emotion. "I know you do, Victoria," I replied evenly. She offered a tired, apologetic smile and placed the wrinkled gift bag squarely on the center of my immaculate mahogany desk. I felt terrible rushing straight from the boardroom, but I managed to pick this up for you earlier today. Happy 35th anniversary, my love. I reached forward and slowly pulled the tissue paper aside. Inside the bag lay a remarkably cheap, terribly patterned silk tie. It was the kind of mass-produced accessory you might grab at a discount store out of sheer panicked obligation. I am a man who wears exclusively custom-tailored suits from London and Italy. I have not worn an off-the-rack tie in over 3 decades. Yet I held the pathetic fabric up to the dim light, as if she had just handed me a priceless artifact. "Thank you, Victoria," I said softly. "It is exactly what I needed." As she leaned forward to accept my gratitude, the ambient light from the hallway caught something brilliantly sharp on her left wrist. My eyes immediately locked onto the object. It was a brand new, flawlessly set diamond tennis bracelet. The stones were large, expertly cut, and blindingly clear. I am an incredibly wealthy man, and I know the precise market value of high-end jewelry. That single piece easily cost north of $80,000. I did not buy that bracelet for her. I had spent the past month coordinating with a private jeweler in Geneva to craft a custom emerald necklace for tonight. So the question immediately formed in my deeply calculating mind. Who purchased an $80,000 diamond bracelet for my wife? The answer was painfully obvious. Damien Pierce. But Damien, despite his generous executive salary, did not have the kind of disposable liquid cash required to casually drop $80,000 on a mistress. He was a young man with heavy mortgages and an extravagant lifestyle. Buying that bracelet meant he was accessing funds that did not rightfully belong to him. He was likely bleeding my company dry right beneath my nose. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the cheap tie in my hands, fighting the intense burning desire to grab her wrist and demand a full accounting of every single diamond. Instead, I carefully folded the cheap tie and placed it back into the wrinkled gift bag. I needed to test the exact perimeter of her lies. I needed to see how quickly she could spin a web when presented with an unexpected variable. "I hope the food at the board meeting was at least tolerable," I casually remarked, leaning back into the deep shadows of my chair. "Oh, it was just terrible cold catered sandwiches and bitter coffee," she complained seamlessly, waving her diamond-clad wrist in the air. "I would have given absolutely anything to be sitting across from you at Le Bernardin enjoying a proper anniversary meal." I let a long, heavy silence stretch between us. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, counting the agonizing seconds. I stared directly into her eyes, searching for any trace of the woman who once shared a drafty, freezing apartment with me. There was nothing left but a polished, hollow shell. "That is quite unfortunate," I finally said, my voice dropping to a low conversational whisper. "Because while I was sitting alone at Le Bernardin, waiting for you to finish your exhausting meeting, I happened to leave something very specific on a table near the back." Victoria froze. The casual, elegant posture she was projecting instantly stiffened. Her breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. I left a crisp $100 bill. I continued slowly measuring the precise impact of every single word, but I did not just leave it flat on the white tablecloth. I folded it. A very tight crease here, a sharp fold there. I shaped it into a tiny paper rose. "Do you remember those, Victoria? Do you remember the paper roses? I left it right next to a cell phone on a table where a beautiful woman in an emerald green dress was sitting. I was simply wondering if by some strange miracle of fate you happened to see it." For one terrifying electric moment, absolute panic flashed across Victoria's eyes. It was a microscopic fracture in her flawless porcelain mask. Her pupils dilated, and her jaw tightened involuntarily. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She had found the origami rose on her table after Damien kissed her. She knew I had been there. She knew I had seen them. But then something truly chilling happened. I watched her forcefully suppress the panic. I watched her biological survival instinct completely override her initial shock. She took a deep, steadying breath, and the warm, affectionate smile instantly returned to her face. It was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. "Harrison, darling," she said, her voice dripping with genuine-sounding concern. "Are you feeling all right tonight?" I stared at her, waiting for the lie to fully materialize. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. She walked around the edge of the heavy mahogany desk and placed a comforting, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "You are thoroughly confusing your memories again, sweetie," she murmured, looking at me with deep, manufactured pity. "You gave me that $100 bill this morning in the kitchen before I left for the foundation. You told me to buy coffee for the charity staff. Do you really not remember doing that?" I did not move a single muscle. I had not given her any cash this morning. I had not seen her in the kitchen at all today. "You must have simply daydreamed about folding it into a rose while you were sitting alone at the restaurant," she continued, her voice soothing and incredibly dangerous. "You are becoming so terribly forgetful lately, Harrison. We really need to get you an appointment with the doctor to check your memory." She was actively testing my mental clarity. This was a premeditated psychological attack designed to destroy my life. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my darkened study until the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in pale shades of gray. I knew precisely what Victoria was doing. She was laying the groundwork for a narrative of complete cognitive decline. If she could legally prove that my mind was failing, she could invoke the medical proxy clauses in our estate planning. That would grant her immediate executive control over Caldwell Logistics and total access to my personal fortune. I refused to let her see that I understood her treacherous game. When I finally emerged from the study, I acted slightly disoriented, playing the exact role she had cast for me. I rubbed my temples, complained of a mild headache, and asked the household staff if they had seen my reading glasses, which were already resting in my breast pocket. Victoria watched me with a look of feigned, gentle sympathy, but I could see the cold, calculating triumph dancing in her eyes. The psychological siege began in earnest the very next morning. I always keep the heavy brass key to my private wall safe inside the top right drawer of my mahogany desk. It is a habit I have maintained religiously for over 30 years. When I went to retrieve a set of sensitive documents, the key was inexplicably missing. I methodically checked every drawer, every pocket of my tailored suits, and the floor beneath my desk. I knew exactly where I had left it. An hour later, as I was pouring a glass of cold water in the kitchen, Victoria walked up behind me. She opened the refrigerator door, gasped in theatrical surprise, and pulled my brass safe key from the top shelf right next to a carton of milk. She held it out to me with a trembling hand and a look of absolute pity. "Harrison, what on earth is your safe key doing in the refrigerator?" she asked, her voice carrying a perfectly calibrated tone of wifely concern. "You must have put it in here when you grabbed a snack last night." I stared at the cold brass resting in her palm. The sheer audacity of her action was breathtaking. I had not opened the refrigerator in 3 entire days. Our private chef prepared all my meals. She had purposefully taken the key from my locked study and placed it beside the milk to manufacture a glaring symptom of dementia. I slowly reached out and took the key from her hand, maintaining a completely blank expression. "I must have been terribly distracted," I replied softly, rubbing my forehead. Victoria patted my arm, letting out a heavy, sorrowful sigh that was meant to crush my confidence. "We really need to get you examined, darling," she murmured, before walking away. The next day, the gaslighting escalated from household tricks to aggressive corporate sabotage. I brought a stack of highly classified financial reports home from the office to review a pending acquisition in Europe. I left the blue folder squarely on my desk when I went to the dining room for a brief lunch. When I returned 30 minutes later, the folder was gone. I searched the entire study, checking the trash bins and the filing cabinets. I eventually found the blue folder sitting on the patio table outside in the freezing wind, its pages scattered across the cold stone tiles. When I confronted Victoria, she looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. She swore she had seen me carry the folder outside while I was talking on the phone. She claimed I had been wandering the garden muttering to myself about cargo routes, completely unaware of the freezing cold. It was a brilliant, vicious lie. She was not merely trying to convince me that I was losing my mind. She was carefully staging these incidents so the household staff would witness my supposed decline. The staff would unknowingly become her star witnesses when she eventually filed for legal guardianship. I gathered the scattered papers from the freezing patio and returned to my study, locking the heavy doors behind me. I sat down and let the dark reality of her betrayal wash over me completely. She was trying to break my spirit, to make me actively doubt my own reality. But she had fundamentally misunderstood the sheer resilience of the man she married. She thought she was breaking down a weak, wealthy old man. She did not realize she was waking up a sleeping, incredibly dangerous predator. On the 3rd day of her campaign, I stood quietly in the shadowed hallway just outside the main living room. I heard the low, conspiratorial murmur of voices. Victoria was speaking to Maria, our head housekeeper of 15 years. Victoria was holding a lace handkerchief to her eyes, perfectly faking a quiet, devastated sob. "It is just breaking my heart, Maria," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "His mind is completely going. He forgets where he puts his most important documents. He wanders the house aimlessly at night. I do not know how much longer I can handle this burden alone. I need you to keep a very close eye on him when I am at the foundation. He might become a serious danger to himself." Maria nodded sympathetically, entirely fooled by the masterful performance. Listening to her carefully poison the loyalty of my staff, I felt a deep, familiar coldness settle over my heart. I remembered standing in a smoke-filled warehouse back in the late 1980s, negotiating a brutal multi-million-dollar union contract with men who would just as soon break my legs as shake my hand. I had stared down massive, intimidating mob bosses who threatened to burn my delivery trucks to ash if I did not pay their exorbitant protection fees. I had faced those terrifying, violent threats without shedding a single drop of sweat. I had outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and completely crushed men far more dangerous and far more intelligent than Victoria could ever hope to be. I recognized a hostile psychological siege the absolute moment I saw one. She was fighting a war she had absolutely no capacity to win. I quietly backed away from the hallway, retreating to the absolute safety of my study. I knew that reacting with immediate anger would only play directly into her narrative. If I yelled, she would call me erratic and aggressive, If I forcefully defended myself, she would call me confused and combative. The only way to survive this kind of calculated assault was to fully embrace it. Had to let her blindly believe she was winning. I had to feed her massive ego, giving her the exact symptoms she desperately wanted to see. The ultimate confirmation of her trap arrived an hour later. The heavy silence of my study was shattered by the sharp ringing of my desk phone. I picked up the receiver. It was my private physician. "Harrison," he said briskly, "I have been speaking with Victoria regarding your recent cognitive episodes. I need you to come into my private clinic immediately for an urgent follow-up. We need to discuss your immediate legal options." I listened to the dial tone after my physician hung up. "We need to discuss your immediate legal options." Those words echoed in the dark study. I placed the receiver down. Victoria had not just stolen my safe key or scattered my confidential files. She was preparing a detailed narrative painting a masterful portrait of a declining patriarch who could no longer govern his own mind, let alone a global empire. The drive to the clinic the next morning was cloaked in heavy fog. Sitting in my town car, I watched the glass towers loom like silent sentinels. I had built Caldwell Logistics from the ground up, fighting for every corporate contract. I knew exactly how hostile corporate takeovers functioned. Usually they involved aggressive stock buyouts and relentless boardroom lobbying. I never anticipated the most devastating hostile takeover of my career would be orchestrated from my own dining room table. When I walked into the office of Dr. Aris, the atmosphere was suffocatingly solemn. He had been my personal physician for over 15 years, always treating me with the utmost respect. Today, however, as I sat across from his polished desk, he did not look at me with respect. He looked at me with deep pity. It was the specific kind of patronizing sympathy reserved for the helpless and the dying. "Harrison, thank you for coming in so quickly." He began folding his hands over a thick file folder. "Victoria called me yesterday evening. She was practically in tears about your recent behavior. She detailed highly concerning incidents, misplacing keys, leaving corporate documents blowing around the yard, and significant memory lapses." I sat perfectly still, maintaining a slightly confused expression, perfectly mimicking an aging man overwhelmed by his failing faculties. "Is that what she told you?" I asked softly, letting a trace of vulnerability seep into my carefully controlled voice. "She is terrified for you, Harrison," Dr. Aris continued. "She explained how you have been wandering the house at night, completely disoriented. She mentioned you display uncharacteristic paranoia, suspecting the staff of moving your personal items. Given your age and the immense pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, these symptoms simply cannot be ignored." He opened the folder and pulled out a prescription pad. "We need to run a comprehensive battery of neurological scans next week to establish a definitive baseline. However, based on the severe rapid onset of these specific episodes and Victoria's detailed timeline, I am preemptively prescribing you a heavy regimen of cholinesterase inhibitors. These medications manage early-stage Alzheimer's disease." The words hung in the sterile air. Early-stage Alzheimer's. In that singular, terrifying moment, the final curtain lifted and the entire scope of Victoria's true agenda became crystal clear. The shocking scene I had witnessed at Le Bernardin, my wife passionately kissing Damien Pierce, was suddenly relegated to a mere sideshow. Her infidelity was nothing but a vulgar byproduct. She did not just want Damien's affection, and she certainly did not just want a quiet divorce. She wanted absolute control of Caldwell Logistics. If I contested a divorce, she would walk away with a fraction of my wealth due to our ironclad prenuptial agreement. But if she successfully built a verified medical paper trail proving I was suffering from severe cognitive decline, she could easily invoke the medical proxy clauses embedded deep within our estate planning. She would immediately gain total executive authority. She and Damien would control the board of directors, the liquid assets, the offshore accounts, and the entire corporate infrastructure I had bled for decades to build. They were forging the perfect legal weapon to lock me in an upscale nursing facility while they plundered my entire kingdom. A searing wave of pure hatred crashed against my ribcage, begging to be unleashed. I wanted to grab Dr. Aris by the collar, slam him against his medical degrees hanging on the wall, and scream that he was acting as a blind, foolish pawn in a massive corporate conspiracy. I wanted to demand a full toxicological screening to see if Victoria had been slipping something into my evening meals to simulate lethargy. I wanted to burn everything to the ground right then and there. Instead, I did the most difficult thing I have ever done in my 70 years of life. I smiled. It was a weak, trembling, heartbreaking smile of a man who was finally surrendering to the devastating reality of his fading mind. I reached across the desk with a slightly shaking hand and carefully took the printed prescription. "Thank you, doctor," I whispered, staring down at the paper as if it held a death sentence. I suppose Victoria has always been much more observant than I am. I will start taking these immediately. I just want to ensure my company and my family are fully protected if I can no longer lead them. "You are making the right decision, Harrison," he replied, visibly relieved that I was not fighting the diagnosis. "Victoria is a wonderful, devoted woman. You are incredibly lucky to have her looking out for your best interests during this difficult transition." I nodded slowly, carefully, folding the prescription and sliding it into the interior pocket of my custom suit jacket. I stood up, thanked him once more, and walked out of the sterile office with the slow, defeated gait of a broken man. I kept my head bowed and my eyes cast down as I navigated the long, brightly lit corridors of the medical building, completely playing the role they had written for me. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and stepped out into the freezing Chicago air, my posture instantly transformed. The feigned weakness vanished. My spine straightened into a rigid line of pure, lethal determination. My mind was no longer clouded by the shock of betrayal. It was entirely focused on the mechanics of complete systematic destruction. Victoria and Damien thought they were brilliant. They thought they were circling a wounded, dying animal. They had no idea they had just stepped directly into a cage with a monster. I walked to my town car and slid inside. I did not give my driver a destination immediately. Instead, I reached into my pocket, bypassing the fraudulent prescription, and pulled out the crisp, white business card I had received 2 nights ago in the shadows of the restaurant. There was no company logo, no title, just a name and a direct phone number printed in plain black ink. Evelyn Sterling. The stranger who had forcefully grabbed my arm, the woman who had warned me to stay calm because the real show was about to begin. She had known precisely what was happening long before I even suspected a single thing. She knew Damien, and she clearly knew his ruthless playbook. I dialed the number, listening to the sharp, mechanical rings echo in the quiet cabin of my car. The line clicked open. There was no greeting, just the faint sound of city traffic in the background. I stared out the tinted window at the towering skyline I had helped shape with my own 2 hands. "I am ready to listen," I said. The voice on the other end of the line did not hesitate for a single second. Evelyn quickly gave me a street address for an old run-down diner located on the far industrial south side of the city. She strictly instructed me to leave my luxury town car and my personal driver several blocks away, ensuring that I walked the final stretch entirely alone to avoid drawing any unwanted attention to our highly secretive meeting. I did exactly as she asked, without raising a single question. I stepped out of the warm leather interior of my vehicle and directly into the biting, unforgiving Chicago wind. I wrapped my heavy tailored cashmere overcoat tightly around my shoulders and began to navigate the cracked, uneven concrete sidewalks of a neighborhood I had not set foot in since my early days hauling heavy freight cargo. The diner was a decaying relic of a bygone era. The rusted neon sign hanging above the main entrance flickered inconsistently, buzzing loudly with a low, threatening electrical hum. Inside the establishment, the stagnant air was incredibly thick with the heavy scent of stale, burned coffee and old fried grease. It was completely empty save for a deeply tired-looking cook lazily wiping down the grill in the back and Evelyn. She was sitting perfectly straight in a faded, torn red vinyl booth at the very rear of the room, partially hidden in the shadows. She was slowly drinking bitter black coffee from a severely chipped ceramic mug. As I silently slid into the cramped booth directly across from her, she did not offer a polite greeting or a friendly smile. She simply pushed a stained paper menu aside and locked her sharp, highly assessing eyes entirely onto mine. "I am extremely glad you finally called me Harrison," she said, her voice remaining perfectly steady and incredibly commanding. "I was honestly beginning to worry that Victoria might have successfully convinced you to willingly check into a luxury memory care facility before we even had the chance to speak tonight." I placed my large hands completely flat on the sticky surface of the tabletop, refusing to break her intense gaze. "I am not losing my mind," I replied with cold, absolute certainty. "My wife is actively trying to manufacture a detailed medical history in order to legally declare me incompetent. She desperately wants the company for herself, and she is working intimately with Damien Pierce to get it." Evelyn took a very slow, deliberate sip of her hot coffee and nodded solemnly. "I know she is. But you are fundamentally misunderstanding the true terrifying nature of the massive threat you are currently facing. You think this is simply a greedy, dissatisfied wife having a sordid, pathetic affair with a much younger executive. You think they just want to drain your personal bank accounts and aggressively take over your corporate board seat. You are completely wrong." I narrowed my eyes at her, feeling a sharp prickle of genuine alarm. "Then tell me what it actually is, Evelyn. Who exactly are you, and what is your specific interest in my chief operating officer?" Evelyn leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so the distracted cook could not possibly hear a single word over the loud scraping of his metal spatula. "My name is Evelyn Sterling. Before I officially retired, I spent 25 grueling years working as a senior financial investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I have spent my entire professional career relentlessly tracking down complex corporate fraud, illegal international wire transfers, and incredibly hostile takeovers orchestrated by hidden shadow entities. And for the last 5 painful years, I have been privately hunting Damien Pierce. I felt a cold, heavy knot tighten violently in the very pit of my stomach. I personally hired Damien directly out of a highly respected rival logistics firm, I said, defending my own judgment. His executive resume was absolutely flawless. He had brilliant, verifiable references from top industry leaders. "His flawless resume is a carefully constructed, masterful fiction," Evelyn countered smoothly, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. "Damien Pierce is not a brilliant logistics prodigy. He is a highly trained, utterly ruthless corporate raider who functions like a virus. He specifically targets incredibly wealthy legacy companies that are run by aging founders. He flawlessly infiltrates their highest executive ranks, earns their total trust, and then he systematically hollows out the entire corporation from the inside until nothing is left but an empty shell." She reached a steady hand into her dark leather handbag and slowly pulled out a small, physically worn photograph. She placed it face up on the table, squarely between us. The picture showed a kind-looking, slightly balding man with deeply tired eyes standing proudly in front of a sprawling modern tech campus. "That was my husband Arthur," she said, her voice instantly dropping to a profoundly painful, quiet register that commanded total silence. "He built a revolutionary data storage firm entirely from scratch, much like you built your own empire. We were happily married for 30 amazing years. Arthur was undeniably brilliant, but as he got older, he wanted to step back and simply enjoy the wealth he had worked so hard to build. He decided to hire a bright, charismatic young executive to help him transition out of the daily stressful operations. That charismatic young man was Damien." I stared down at the photograph, the terrifying, undeniable parallels already fully forming in my calculating mind. "What exactly did Damien do to him?" I asked quietly. Evelyn took a very shaky breath, her seasoned professional demeanor cracking just enough to reveal a profound, unhealed grief. "He did exactly what he is doing to you right now, Harrison. He carefully identified Arthur's weakest point, and he exploited it completely, without a shred of mercy. Damien deliberately isolated my husband. He slowly took absolute control of the internal financial systems, completely locking Arthur out of his own company's digital servers under the clever guise of necessary security upgrades. Then Damien began the devastating psychological warfare. He started moving important things around Arthur's private office. He expertly forged complex financial documents to make Arthur firmly believe he was making catastrophic, ruinous financial errors. Over time, he thoroughly convinced the entire board of directors that my poor husband was suffering from severe early-onset dementia. My blood ran completely ice-cold in my veins. Victoria's deliberately staged incidents with the missing brass safe key and the mysteriously scattered blue patio documents flashed vividly in my memory like a warning siren. The newly forged, completely devastating medical diagnosis, currently resting in my tailored breast pocket, suddenly felt as heavy as a solid lead weight. Arthur tried desperately to fight back. Evelyn continued, angry tears welling in her eyes, though she proudly refused to let a single one fall. But Damien was always 3 brilliant steps ahead of him. Damien maliciously manipulated the company's internal legal counsel into completely rewriting the crucial executive proxy clauses. By the time I truly realized what was actually happening inside those walls, it was far too late to stop the bleeding. Damien executed a flawless, hostile takeover, legally stripping Arthur of his entire life's work in a single afternoon. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation and the crushing, inescapable reality of simultaneously losing his mind and his beloved empire completely broke my strong husband. Exactly 5 years ago, Arthur walked into his empty, quiet office, locked the heavy wooden door, and tragically ended his own life. The dirty diner grew incredibly silent, save for the hum of the lights. The constant, irritating buzzing of the broken neon sign outside suddenly felt absolutely deafening in my ears. I looked at Evelyn, a strong woman who had lost absolutely everything she loved, to the exact same merciless monster who was currently sleeping in my wife's bed. I felt a profound, burning kinship with her in that dark moment. "I am so incredibly sorry for your loss, Evelyn," I murmured sincerely. She wiped her eyes fiercely and squared her shoulders with immense dignity. "I do not want your pity, Harrison. I want absolute justice." The local authorities carelessly ruled Arthur's tragic death a simple suicide brought on by severe mental decline. They blatantly refused to officially investigate Damien. He walked away with millions of dollars and quickly moved on to his next wealthy target. "You." She reached back into her leather handbag and withdrew a small, surprisingly heavy metal object. It was a highly secure, heavily encrypted USB drive. She slid it smoothly across the sticky table until it rested right against my fingertips. "I have spent the last 2 years secretly tracking Damien's hidden digital footprint deep within your organization," she explained, her tone shifting seamlessly back to that of a seasoned, relentless investigator. "This drive contains everything I have managed to find so far. Damien is doing the exact same thing to you right now. He is slowly locking you out of your own house. And your deeply greedy wife is standing there holding the front door completely open for him." I slowly picked up the encrypted drive. Its cold metal casing felt incredibly heavy with devastating, undeniable potential. "If Damien is a professional corporate raider," I said slowly, meticulously, piecing the horrible, complex puzzle together in my mind, "then he is not just trying to take over Caldwell Logistics for the executive salary. My company handles millions of tons of heavy international freight every single day. We have hundreds of interconnected, highly complex shell accounts for paying diverse global shipping tariffs." "Exactly," Evelyn whispered, her eyes shining with dark confirmation. "He is not just trying to steal your personal wealth, Harrison. Your massive company is the absolute perfect, untraceable vehicle." The sheer magnitude of the realization hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. My entire corporate network, the flawless, pristine empire I had spent decades keeping entirely clean and legally sound, was severely compromised. If Damien was intentionally moving vast amounts of shadow funds through my legitimate shipping accounts, this was absolutely no longer a simple case of a greedy wife casually plotting a standard hostile corporate takeover. This was massive, highly illegal international money laundering. And because I was still actively serving as the chief executive officer of the corporation, my personal name was officially stamped on every single fraudulent transaction he made. Damien was actively building a massive federal criminal case against me, while simultaneously convincing the entire world I was rapidly losing my mind. If I fought back without irrefutable proof, I went straight to federal prison for a very long time. If I blindly surrendered my proxy, I ended up locked away in a sterile psychiatric ward, just like Evelyn's poor husband. I gripped the cold metal drive tightly in my palm, my mind racing forward. I slipped the heavy encrypted drive deep into my coat pocket and slid out of the worn vinyl booth. I offered Evelyn a single grim nod of profound gratitude before turning my back on the flickering neon lights. The harsh wind whipped against my face as I retraced my deliberate steps through the dark, unforgiving industrial district. My luxury town car was waiting precisely where I had commanded its engine, idling quietly in the desolate shadows. I instructed my driver to take the longest possible route back to the estate. I needed absolute silence to mentally map the treacherous battlefield stretching out before me. Damien Pierce believed he possessed the ultimate strategic advantage because he controlled the digital high ground. He mistakenly assumed my age equated to technological ignorance. He had spent months secretly locking down my administrative permissions, completely sealing me out of the daily financial operations of my own shipping empire. What he failed to realize was that I had personally supervised the construction of our central server architecture 15 years ago. My driver pulled the long black car through the heavy iron security gates, bringing us to a smooth halt before the sprawling estate just past the midnight hour. The massive stone house was completely draped in a thick, unusually heavy silence that felt almost suffocating. I walked completely silently through the expansive marble foyer, deliberately bypassing the curving grand staircase that led directly up to the sprawling master suite, where Victoria was undoubtedly sleeping her deep, perfectly guiltless sleep. I entered my private study and closed the heavy oak doors, ensuring the deadbolt slid into place with a quiet, satisfying click. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I relied solely on the sharp blue glow of my secure desktop monitor. I sat down in my leather chair, plugged Evelyn's encrypted drive into the hidden port beneath my desk, and waited for the complex decryption software to initialize. While the drive slowly unpacked thousands of deeply buried financial records, I began my own covert digital infiltration. Damien had erected brilliant, seemingly impenetrable firewalls meant to aggressively block any standard executive login attempts. He had successfully revoked my primary credentials. However, I never trusted standard security protocols. 15 long years ago, long before Damien Pierce was even hired as a minor executive trainee, I carefully and secretly hard-coded a supreme administrative backdoor directly into the very foundational framework of the corporation's central servers. It was an entirely invisible, highly classified digital access point known exclusively to me, completely hidden from any standard audits. My steady fingers moved swiftly across the heavy mechanical keyboard, typing out a very long, incredibly complex sequence of alphanumeric commands that flawlessly bypassed his modern, expensive firewalls completely. The bright screen flickered twice, and suddenly, the entire beating heart of Caldwell Logistics was completely exposed and laid bare before me. I instantly bypassed the polished, neatly packaged quarterly spreadsheets. Those pristine reports were nothing but beautiful mathematical lies, designed to pacify a trusting board of directors. I dove straight into the raw, unfiltered transaction logs. I did not need a specialized accounting degree to understand what I was looking at. I simply relied on the raw, deeply ingrained street-smart intuition that had kept me alive on the brutal Chicago docks 4 decades ago. Back then, when corrupt union bosses and ruthless smugglers wanted to hide illegal cargo, they never used complex, mysterious routes. They hid their dirty freight in plain sight, burying it beneath layers of incredibly boring, mundane shipping manifests. They created a dizzying maze of legitimate-looking paperwork to completely exhaust anyone trying to track the physical containers. Hiding dirty money operates on the exact same fundamental principle. I ignored the large, obvious operational expenses and focused entirely on the massive volume of small, repetitive offshore wire transfers. I began to cross-reference the raw routing numbers from my servers with the encrypted data Evelyn had provided. The cascading numbers on the bright screen began to align with terrifying absolute precision. Damien was systematically bleeding my massive corporate treasury, but the sheer volume of the stolen capital required a massive, perfectly legitimate-looking funnel to clean the funds before they disappeared overseas. My eyes scanned the endless rows of digital data searching for the central bleeding artery. It took me 3 grueling hours of relentless tracking before I finally located the massive financial hemorrhage. The stolen millions were not being hidden in abstract corporate acquisitions or inflated international shipping tariffs. They were being quietly funneled directly into the Caldwell Logistics Charity Foundation. My stomach twisted violently. The Charity Foundation was the exact entity Victoria proudly ran. It was the very same organization she used as her bulletproof alibi tonight. She had claimed she was exhausted from reviewing foundation budgets. She was not reviewing charity budgets at all. She was actively processing massive, highly illegal wire transfers. The brilliant, sickening elegance of their vicious plan became entirely clear. As the beloved, socially prominent wife of a billionaire, nobody would ever dare question Victoria's generous philanthropic endeavors. She was utilizing the untouchable, pure reputation of the charity to quietly shift enormous sums of money into a sprawling network of ghost shell companies. I tracked the complex destination codes for these invisible organizations. They were all registered in remote, highly secretive tax havens. Damien was acting as the chief operating officer, quietly approving the massive outgoing corporate donations from my primary business accounts into Victoria's foundation. Then Victoria was immediately redirecting those funds into the shadow accounts. They were working in perfect malicious tandem, draining my life's work while simultaneously preparing the complex legal paperwork to declare me legally incompetent. If their plan succeeded, I would be locked in a gilded medical cage, and they would be infinitely wealthy, completely free to enjoy the massive fortune they had stolen together. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my vision blurring slightly from the intense, unrelenting focus. I needed to see the final undeniable proof. I needed to see exactly how they were legally authorizing the ultimate release of funds from the offshore ghost accounts into their own private hidden wealth portfolios. I executed a highly complex search protocol, digging past the heavy encryption, guarding the final transactional receipts. The screen refreshed, displaying a long, detailed ledger of completed irreversible international wire transfers. Millions of dollars had already been successfully moved. I clicked on the most recent transaction, a massive transfer of $4 million executed just 3 hours ago, right around the time I was sitting alone at the restaurant. A highly secure digital signature was absolutely required to authorize a transfer of that immense magnitude. I stared at the bright blue screen, waiting for the authorization credentials to slowly render. When the final digital signature appeared on the electronic document, the remaining breath instantly vanished from my lungs. My blood ran completely ice-cold. The signature authorizing the massive, highly illegal transfer of stolen funds did not belong to Damien Pierce. It did not belong to my deeply treacherous wife, Victoria. The flawless, perfectly verified digital signature glaring back at me from the bright screen was my own. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes straining against the harsh blue light of the screen. I blinked hard, forcing my exhausted mind to focus on the stark black letters of the digital authorization stamp. My initial assumption, born from the sheer panic of the moment, had been entirely wrong. The flawless, perfectly verified digital signature glaring back at me from the terminal was not my own. It did not belong to Damien Pierce. It did not belong to my treacherous wife, Victoria. The name officially authorizing the massive, highly illegal transfer of stolen corporate funds belonged to Valerie, my daughter, my sweet, incredibly trusting 24-year-old daughter. My chest heaved as I stared at her name, feeling an icy, paralyzing dread spread through my veins. Valerie had always been the absolute light of my life. Unlike the ruthless corporate sharks I dealt with daily, she possessed a gentle, compassionate spirit. When she graduated from university last year, she did not want a lucrative executive position within Caldwell Logistics. She specifically asked to work in the charitable division. She wanted to manage the philanthropic foundation to distribute our wealth to communities in need. I proudly gave her the position, thrilled that she would be working closely alongside her mother. I had blindly thought it would be a beautiful bonding experience for the two women I loved most in this world. Instead, it was a perfectly constructed slaughterhouse. I frantically opened another transaction, my hands shaking over the keyboard. Valerie's signature. I opened 5 more offshore wire transfers, pulling up the metadata for every single one. Valerie. 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 The sickening, horrific truth of their master plan slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. Victoria had not merely given our daughter a desk at the foundation to keep her busy. She had systematically, deliberately positioned her own child to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb. I could picture the daily manipulation with absolute agonizing clarity. I could see Victoria walking into Valerie's bright office, handing her stacks of incredibly complex financial documents hidden beneath legitimate charity proposals. I could hear my wife's soothing maternal voice assuring our daughter that these were standard routine approvals for international aid programs. Valerie, eager to please and completely trusting of her own mother, would have signed those digital documents without a single second thought. Why would she ever suspect that the woman who raised her was actively handing her the pen to sign her own death warrant? Because these were not simple charity forms. They were federal wire fraud authorizations. They were the undeniable digital footprints of a massive multi-million-dollar international money laundering syndicate. Damian Pierce and Victoria were not just stealing my vast wealth. They were aggressively insulating themselves from the catastrophic legal fallout. They knew that if the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FBI ever decided to kick down the doors of Caldwell Logistics, the federal agents would not come looking for the chief operating officer. They would not investigate the grieving wife who was claiming her husband was suffering from dementia. The federal agents would follow the rigid paper trail straight to the director of the charity foundation. They would arrest Valerie. My beautiful, innocent daughter would be the one handcuffed and dragged into a freezing federal interrogation room. She would be the one facing 20 years in a maximum security prison for orchestrating an international financial conspiracy she knew absolutely nothing about. She would take the entire crushing fall for the massive corporate hemorrhage, legally shielding the true architects of the crime. And while Valerie sat in a concrete cell completely destroyed and terrified, Victoria and Damian would be sitting on a pristine beach in some offshore tax haven, freely spending the millions of dollars they had legally washed through my daughter's name. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it was almost impossible to comprehend. A wife cheating on her husband is a painfully common tragedy. A corporate executive attempting a hostile takeover is just brutal business. But a mother actively, willingly serving up her own flesh and blood to federal prosecutors just to fund a lavish lifestyle with her young lover is something else entirely. It is a level of deep demonic depravity that defies basic human nature. I sat in the heavy silence of my dark study, staring at the bright screen until the glowing text burned into my retinas. A profound, fundamental shift occurred deep within my soul during those agonizing minutes. The crushing, heavy sorrow of a broken marriage completely evaporated. The stinging, bitter humiliation of a bruised male ego vanished into thin air. The quiet, confused old man Victoria was desperately trying to manifest ceased to exist. In his place rose a deeply protective, fiercely dangerous father who had spent 40 years crushing desperate men and wealthy titans alike. I had built a massive empire from the rough, splintered docks of Chicago. I knew how to bleed a man dry without touching him. I knew how to dismantle a life piece by piece until nothing remained but ash. Victoria had made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. She assumed my love for her would make me weak, hesitant, and endlessly forgiving. She had completely forgotten that my love for my daughter made me an absolute monster to anyone who dared to threaten her. I slowly reached out and quietly closed the encrypted files on my desktop monitor. I safely ejected Evelyn's metal drive from the hidden port and slipped it back into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket, right next to the fraudulent medical prescription. I stood up from my leather chair. My joints did not ache. My mind was not clouded by the slightest shadow of dementia. I felt incredibly sharp, perfectly focused, and completely terrifyingly calm. The howling wind battered against the heavy glass windows of my study, but the room itself was entirely still. I walked deliberately over to the large antique globe resting in the corner of the room. I reached behind the wooden stand and retrieved my private, untraceable cellular phone, a device I kept strictly isolated from the Caldwell Logistics internal network. I unlocked the screen and pulled up the single newly added contact. The digital clock on my desk read 3 in the morning. It did not matter. When dealing with predators, time is completely irrelevant. I pressed the small green button and raised the phone to my ear, listening to the quiet mechanical ringing. Evelyn Sterling answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and instantly alert, as if she had been sitting in the dark waiting for this exact moment. "You found the offshore routing numbers," Evelyn stated flatly. Her voice lacked any trace of surprise. She knew what I was looking for, and she knew exactly what I would inevitably find. "I found much more than that," I replied, my voice stripped of all emotion, echoing with a cold, mechanical, and absolute authority. "Damian Pierce is not the only monster in this house. My wife has forged the digital signatures to frame my daughter for the entire laundering operation. If federal authorities move in, Valerie will take the fall." Evelyn exhaled a sharp sigh over the secure connection, fully grasping the catastrophic gravity of my discovery. "They are building a firewall out of your own flesh and blood," she whispered, her tone laced with dark sorrow. "If you move against them blindly now, prosecutors will simply follow the digital ink. They will immediately arrest Valerie before Damian even packs his bags." I knew she was absolutely right. The game had fundamentally changed overnight. I was no longer fighting merely to save my logistics empire or my immense personal fortune. I was fighting for my innocent daughter's life. I explicitly told Evelyn to remain completely hidden and to keep ruthlessly tracking the offshore shadow accounts. I promised to contact her the moment the trap was fully set. I disconnected the secure line, placed the phone back into its hidden compartment behind the antique globe, and watched the sunrise slowly flood my study with a cold, unforgiving light. 2 hours later, my driver pulled the heavy luxury town car up to the towering glass facade of Caldwell Logistics headquarters. I stepped out into the bustling city, mourning, meticulously adjusting my custom suit jacket. I needed to instantly deliver the absolute greatest acting performance of my entire 70 years of existence. Victoria and Damian had carefully built a compelling medical narrative detailing my rapid cognitive decline. It was time for me to give their manufactured reality a terrifyingly convincing face. I walked slowly through the grand corporate lobby. My usual brisk, commanding executive stride was deliberately broken down into a cautious, incredibly hesitant shuffle. I did not greet the reception staff by their first names, as was my strict, decades-long custom. Instead, I offered a vague, slightly confused nod, staring blankly past them into the void. The panicked whispers undoubtedly began before the polished elevator doors even closed completely behind me. When I finally reached the top executive floor, the sprawling glass-walled corridor was actively humming with standard morning activity. Damian Pierce was standing right near the center of the open bullpen, holding a sleek tablet and dictating fast orders to a group of junior analysts. He looked impossibly arrogant, practically glowing with the massive stolen wealth he was currently siphoning from my charitable foundation. I approached the gathered group with a very slight, highly noticeable tremor in my aging hands. Damian slowly turned, flashing that perfectly practiced, deeply deferential smile he constantly used to mask his absolute ruthlessness. "Good morning, Harrison," he said smoothly. "We are just reviewing the complicated European shipping manifests for the upcoming third quarter." I stared back at him with utterly empty, deeply unfocused eyes. I let a long, deeply painful silence stretch heavily over the eager group. I blinked several times, gently rubbing my forehead, as if desperately trying to grasp a fleeting distant memory. Yes, the shipping manifests, I murmured softly, my voice intentionally lacking its usual, terrifying, booming authority. But please forgive me, son. What exactly is your current functional role in this specific department? Again, are you the new regional logistics coordinator? The junior analysts completely froze. A total, immensely uncomfortable silence fell over the busy bullpen. Damian Pierce was the chief operating officer of the entire global corporation. I had personally promoted him to the extremely powerful position in a massive board meeting just 8 short months ago. Damian's perfectly polished, blinding smile faltered for a mere fraction of a second, but then the profound, deeply greedy realization slowly settled into his dark, calculating eyes. He honestly believed the chemical medication the doctor had prescribed was already working massively, accelerating my mental deterioration. "I am the Chief Operating Officer, Harrison," he replied very softly, using a patronizing, exceedingly gentle tone one might easily reserve for a terribly lost child. "I actively oversee all global corporate operations." I let out a weak, deeply embarrassed chuckle, slowly shaking my head. "Of course you are." "My deepest apologies, Damien. My tired mind is just entirely clouded this morning. Too many late nights, I suppose." To flawlessly seal the performance, I turned toward my private office. My senior executive assistant, a highly efficient woman who had managed my brutal schedule for 10 long years, hurried over with my morning black coffee resting in a delicate porcelain cup and saucer. I slowly reached out to take it. As my fingers brushed the smooth ceramic, I deliberately relaxed my entire grip. The expensive cup slipped straight through my hands, crashing violently onto the polished marble floor. Dark, boiling coffee splattered forcefully across my expensive Italian leather shoes and completely soaked the bottom hem of Damien's impeccably tailored trousers. I visibly panicked, stepping backward and swatting completely uselessly at my ruined suit. "Oh dear God!" I stammered loudly, my voice trembling with perfectly manufactured, overwhelming distress. "I am so incredibly clumsy today. My hands simply will not cooperate at all." "I am terribly sorry, Damien." My assistant immediately rushed forward with thick towels, apologizing profusely, even though the glaring fault was entirely my own. Damien simply stepped backward, calmly, brushing the dark, hot stains from his expensive trousers. "It is perfectly fine, Harrison," he said, his voice completely dripping with that exact same sickeningly sweet sympathy. "Why don't you simply go into your office and rest? I will have the legal department send up the quarterly compliance documents for your official signature. You do not need to worry about any of the complex operational details today." I nodded weakly, happily, letting my worried assistant guide me directly into my massive corner office. Exactly 30 minutes later, Victoria arrived. She floated smoothly through the heavy double doors, wearing a stunning designer trench coat, looking exactly like the deeply grieving, fiercely dedicated wife checking on her struggling, failing husband. She went straight to Damien. I sat quietly at my heavy mahogany desk. Damien's legal aide had just delivered a massive stack of routine corporate compliance documents. I slowly picked up my solid gold fountain pen. Victoria and Damien were standing just outside my glass wall, actively pretending to discuss a minor charity initiative. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the thick paper. I finally found the designated final signature line. Instead of officially signing my proper name on the clearly marked solid line, I deliberately dragged the heavy ink pen diagonally across the dense, complex legal paragraphs, leaving a jagged, utterly nonsensical scrawl that completely ruined the important document. I stared blankly at the ruined page with a look of absolute devastated confusion. I slowly raised my heavy head. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I looked directly at Victoria and Damien. They were actively watching me intently. They saw the completely ruined document. They exchanged a deeply intimate, incredibly rapid glance of pure, triumphant, utterly greedy excitement. Victoria's red lips twitched upward into a microscopic, victorious smirk. They honestly believed my mind was fully broken. The pathetic gaslighting was finally over. I stood up smoothly, locked my heavy office door, and stepped completely into my hidden, fully soundproof server room. I securely locked the inner deadbolt and pulled out my extremely secure private cellular phone. I decisively dialed my highly ruthless corporate lawyer, Bradley Harmon, and then my fiercely loyal son, Preston Caldwell. "Get to Chicago," I commanded them incredibly softly. "Come here very quietly." The following evening, I sat in the center of a sprawling, heavily secured penthouse suite at the Langham Hotel. I had booked the room under a corporate alias, ensuring no digital trail led back to Harrison Caldwell. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn tightly shut against the glittering Chicago skyline. The only illumination came from the sharp glow of 3 encrypted laptops arranged precisely on the large mahogany dining table. Bradley Harmon was the first to arrive. Bradley had been my chief outside legal counsel for 2 decades. He was a man who possessed a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass dictated entirely by absolute loyalty to my family. He did not ask questions when I summoned him. He simply appeared carrying a thick leather briefcase filled with every foundational corporate charter and legal contingency plan we had ever drafted. Shortly after, Evelyn Sterling slipped through the heavy double doors. She moved with the quiet grace of a veteran investigator who had spent her entire life blending into the shadows. She immediately synchronized her encrypted drive with Bradley's secure terminal, linking the offshore routing numbers she had traced with the internal server logs I had extracted. Finally, my son Preston arrived. He walked into the dimly lit suite, his face pale and lined with deep exhaustion from his sudden flight from London. Preston was my eldest child, a brilliant, steady man who ran our European shipping division with honor and integrity. He possessed the same sharp operational mind that I did, but he had a softer heart. He looked around the room, taking in the severe expressions of my lawyer and the stranger typing furiously at the computer. He dropped his travel bag by the door and looked directly at me. I gestured for Preston to take the empty chair across from me. I did not soften the blow. I did not offer him a gentle preamble. I laid the entire horrific truth bare on the polished wooden table. I explained Victoria's meticulously staged gaslighting campaign, her manufactured medical narrative, and her deeply treacherous affair with Damian Pierce. Preston's face darkened with a rising protective fury, but he remained silent, listening intently, as a good executive should. Then I had Evelyn project the offshore wire transfer authorizations onto the large screen at the end of the room. I watched my son's eyes scan the complex digital ledgers. I watched the exact moment his analytical brain registered the final verified digital signature at the bottom of the federal documents. He saw his younger sister's name, Valerie. The color instantly drained completely from his face. He gripped the edge of the heavy table so tightly his knuckles turned a stark bone white. He understood the catastrophic legal implications immediately. If federal authorities raided Caldwell Logistics, they would follow the digital ink straight to the charity foundation. They would bypass the executive suite entirely and arrest Valerie for massive international money laundering. Victoria had coldly, deliberately positioned her own flesh and blood to serve as the ultimate tragic scapegoat. She was willing to let her daughter rot in a federal penitentiary for 20 years just to guarantee her own wealthy, luxurious freedom with Damian. Preston stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "We have to go to the authorities right now," he demanded, his voice shaking with a fierce, desperate anger. "We have to take these internal logs to the FBI and have Damian and Victoria arrested tonight before they can process another single transfer. We can prove Valerie is entirely innocent." I remained perfectly seated, my hands resting flat on the cool table. "No, we cannot do that," I replied softly, my voice carrying a heavy, immovable weight. Bradley looked up from his legal documents and nodded in grim agreement. "If we involve federal agents now, Valerie's digital signature is the only verifiable evidence on the actual wire transfers," Bradley explained methodically. "Damian is incredibly smart. He has insulated his own administrative credentials perfectly. If the government freezes the company assets tomorrow, Valerie goes into a holding cell while they spend 5 years slowly investigating the complex offshore accounts. We cannot risk placing her in the hands of a ruthless federal prosecutor who just wants a quick, high-profile corporate conviction. I stood up and walked slowly around the table until I was standing directly in front of my deeply distressed son. I placed my hands firmly on his trembling shoulders. "Preston," I said, maintaining a steady, unwavering gaze, "I taught you how to build a business. Tonight, I teach you how to destroy an enemy." Preston took a slow, deep breath, forcing his raging emotions back under strict executive control. He nodded once, signaling his absolute readiness. "How do we extract her?" he asked quietly. I turned back to the glowing monitors, looking at Evelyn and Bradley. "We cannot simply fire Damian Pierce," I stated clearly, outlining the bleak tactical reality of our situation. "If I terminate his contract tomorrow, he will instantly trigger his massive golden parachute clause. Worse, he knows the federal wire fraud trail ends directly at Valerie's desk. He will use those highly illegal transfers as a devastating legal bludgeon. He will threaten to anonymously leak the charity foundation ledgers to the authorities if we attempt to pursue him for the missing corporate funds. He holds far too much leverage, and Victoria holds the fabricated medical power of attorney. If I make a hostile move, she will immediately file an emergency injunction claiming I am suffering from severe dementia and acting erratically. The courts would freeze my absolute authority before lunch. Therefore, we must completely flip the board. We cannot force them out. We have to make them deeply, desperately want to leave. We must make Damian and Victoria willingly buy their own total destruction. They believe they are playing a brilliant game of corporate chess. We are going to change the entire landscape of the board while they are distracted by their blinding greed. We need a decoy, a massive, irresistible bait that Damian's raider instincts simply cannot ignore. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a sharp, calculating smile slowly forming on her lips. "You want to offer him a ghost acquisition," she deduced instantly. "You want to present an incredibly lucrative corporate buyout that looks like the crowning achievement of his career." "Exactly," I confirmed, my voice hardening into a cold, absolute resolve. "We will fabricate a massive, highly secretive logistics merger in South America. A deal so incredibly profitable that Damian will eagerly divert all the stolen offshore capital to personally secure it. He will believe he is legally washing the dirty money through a massive, legitimate corporate buyout. But the receiving holding company will be controlled by Bradley. Once Damian wires the stolen funds into our blind trust, we capture the liquid capital." Preston's eyes widened as the sheer brilliance of the trap finally clicked into place. And because Damian will actively authorize that specific massive acquisition himself, his own digital signature will be permanently attached to the incoming dirty money, bypassing Valerie entirely. "Precisely," I said softly. "We will watch him dig his own grave." The next 72 hours were a masterclass in silent corporate warfare. We did not leave the secure penthouse suite at the Langham Hotel. The heavy blackout curtains remained tightly drawn against the Chicago skyline, trapping us in a perpetual high-stakes twilight. Room service delivered our meals, which we ate mechanically over spreadsheets and encrypted legal documents. Bradley Harmon operated with the ruthless precision of a military general. He spread his complex legal charters across the mahogany dining table, charting a breathtakingly aggressive corporate restructuring plan. We were not simply going to build a trap for Damian Pierce and my treacherous wife. We were going to completely hollow out my billion-dollar logistics empire right beneath their arrogant feet. I looked across the table at my son Preston. He had spent the last decade managing our European divisions with quiet, unshakable integrity. He had never once demanded the spotlight or clawed for the coveted chief operating officer title that Damian had stolen. Now I was trusting him with the ultimate survival of my life's work. I authorized Bradley to quietly carve out a completely invisible shadow entity, a holding company registered under multiple layers of absolute corporate anonymity in Geneva. We began the monumental task of severing the clean, incredibly profitable core assets from the main Caldwell logistics framework. We seamlessly transferred our most lucrative international shipping routes, our massive fleets of modern cargo vessels, and our highly classified, perfectly legal government contracts directly into Preston's new shadow corporation. It was a digital and legal hemorrhage executed with surgical perfection. Every single valuable asset I had spent 40 years building was systematically extracted and safely locked away under Preston's exclusive administrative control. I watched my son work tirelessly alongside Bradley, signing the endless streams of encrypted digital transfers. Preston never hesitated. He understood that we were amputating the healthy limbs to save the body before the federal authorities could arrive with their crippling sanctions. Damien believed he controlled the technological high ground because he had locked my administrative access, but his arrogance blinded him to the structural reality of the empire. I had laid the original foundation. I held the absolute master keys. While Damien was busy celebrating his perceived victories and planning to lock me in a psychiatric facility, we were quietly draining the golden blood from the very veins of the company he thought he had conquered. Once the clean assets were completely secured, we turned our attention to the remaining shell. This was where Bradley's true, terrifying genius was fully unleashed on the polished table. A massive corporation like Caldwell Logistics naturally accumulates a tremendous amount of operational friction over several decades. We possessed heavy liabilities, toxic debts, and deeply buried financial hazards that I had spent years carefully managing and suppressing. It was time to unearth every single piece of that highly radioactive corporate waste. We began to legally bundle these catastrophic liabilities. We took over $500 million in heavily toxic, severely underperforming commercial debt and shifted it directly into the center of the trap. But the debt was merely the foundation of the bomb. I authorized Bradley to unseal a series of massive pending Internal Revenue Service audits. These were highly classified, potentially devastating tax discrepancies that I had been fighting a brutal, quiet war to resolve for the past 3 years. If those aggressive audits triggered formal federal penalties, the resulting fines would easily bankrupt any standard corporation. We intentionally tied those looming catastrophic audits directly into the new structure. Finally, we turned to the most lethal component of our manufactured poison. Evelyn Sterling, sitting silently in the corner of the dim suite, provided the exact digital architecture of Damien's ongoing money laundering syndicate. She traced the precise pathways he was utilizing to illegally wash funds through my innocent daughter's charitable foundation. Working with extreme caution, Bradley and I legally tethered those specific, highly fraudulent shell company liabilities directly into our new corporate vessel. We deliberately designed the internal corporate governance so that whoever held the primary executive control of this new entity would be absolutely, undeniably, and legally responsible for the massive offshore laundering operation. We were carefully wrapping a live, ticking federal grenade in layers of beautiful, irresistible financial paper. It was a breathtakingly dangerous maneuver, but it was the only way to completely insulate Valerie from the impending federal strike. By legally shifting the ultimate responsibility for those specific accounts into the new structure, we created a perfect, inescapable legal vacuum. Whoever signed the final ownership documents would automatically inherit the entire criminal enterprise, effectively shielding my daughter from any prosecutorial crosshairs. We spent the final 24 hours of our lockdown meticulously polishing the exterior of our lethal creation. A trap is entirely useless if the prey can clearly see the sharp steel teeth waiting in the dark. We needed a brilliant, blinding disguise. We formally incorporated the new, highly toxic subsidiary and named it Caldwell Apex. It was a perfectly arrogant, deeply prestigious title designed to appeal specifically to Damien's massive, unchecked ego. We structured Caldwell Apex to look like the absolute, undeniable crown jewel of my entire financial empire. We padded the initial surface-level portfolios with complex, incredibly dense legal jargon that heavily implied massive untapped liquidity and exclusive access to the highest tiers of global wealth management. We made it appear as though I was quietly consolidating the most lucrative, incredibly valuable remnants of my personal fortune into this single, heavily guarded vault. To the untrained eye, or even to a highly greedy, overconfident corporate raider, Caldwell Apex looked like the ultimate prize. It looked like the absolute pinnacle of absolute power. But beneath the shiny, completely fabricated veneer, it was nothing but a bottomless pit of catastrophic debt, crushing federal tax liabilities, and severe criminal exposure. The monster was finally born, breathing silently in the dark digital corridors of our secure network, waiting patiently for its new master. I stared at the final, beautifully bound incorporation documents resting squarely on the mahogany table. My signature was not on the bottom line. It required a new proxy. It required a willing victim to step forward and proudly claim the poisoned throne. I looked at Bradley and Preston, feeling the cold, mechanical ruthlessness settling deeply into my bones. The complex legal architecture was entirely flawless. The bait was set with absolute perfection. But the trap was completely useless if they did not take it. I needed Victoria and Damien to actively, desperately covet Caldwell Apex. I needed them to believe that capturing this specific entity was the ultimate victory in their twisted game of deception. I stood up from the large table and carefully smoothed the lapels of my custom suit. The agonizing, sleepless hours spent inside this hidden suite had forged my absolute resolve into pure steel. I was ready to return to my massive estate and look directly into the deceitful eyes of the terrible woman actively trying to destroy my daughter. The board was completely flipped, the heavy pieces were perfectly aligned in the dark, and our massive trap was entirely set. I needed Victoria to believe Caldwell Apex was everything. I returned to the sprawling Caldwell estate, just as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the dark Chicago skyline. The heavy stone mansion was still wrapped in a deep, quiet slumber. I moved silently through the grand foyer, slipping into my private study like a ghost haunting my own life. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I relied only on the soft glow of the brass desk lamp to illuminate my final lethal snare. From my tailored breast pocket, I withdrew the fabricated legal document Bradley Harmon and I had meticulously drafted earlier. It was printed on thick, premium legal paper, completely indistinguishable from my authentic corporate records. Across the top in bold, unmistakable letters it read, "Confidential Draft, Will, and Testament." I placed the document squarely in the center of my heavy mahogany desk. I intentionally angled it slightly, ensuring it looked as though I had been reviewing it late into the night and had simply forgotten to secure it in the wall safe. The document was a masterpiece of legal deception. It explicitly detailed the newly formed entity, Caldwell Apex. The carefully crafted paragraphs stated that Caldwell Apex was the supreme holding company for every single profitable asset, international shipping route, and liquid cash reserve in my entire multi-billion-dollar logistics empire. Most importantly, the final clause contained the ultimate bait. It clearly stipulated that whoever legally acquired 51% controlling interest in Caldwell Apex would automatically inherit absolute unchallenged control of my entire legacy upon my medical incapacitation or death. It was the exact golden ticket Victoria and Damien had been ruthlessly hunting. I picked up my solid gold fountain pen and laid it carelessly across the bottom of the page, a silent testament to an old man whose failing memory could no longer keep his most dangerous secrets safely hidden. Before leaving the quiet study, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a tiny high-definition micro camera. Evelyn Sterling had provided the specialized surveillance equipment, guaranteeing its signal was entirely encrypted and completely invisible to standard network sweeps. I carefully embedded the lens within the intricate binding of a leather-bound encyclopedia resting on the shelf directly behind my desk. It offered a flawless, unobstructed view of the desktop and the heavy wooden doors. I tested the live feed on my secure cellular phone. The crisp, high-resolution image confirmed the trap was perfectly set. I slipped out of the study, quietly locking the door behind me, and walked back out into the freezing morning air. My loyal driver was waiting patiently in the idling luxury town car, parked securely behind. behind the tall privacy hedges bordering the estate. I climbed into the warm leather interior and instructed him to keep the engine running quietly. I did not want to be inside that massive house when the vipers finally woke up. I wanted to watch them from a safe, detached distance. I sat alone in the dim light of the back seat, holding the glowing screen of my phone. The house remained still for another 2 hours. I watched the digital timestamp on the surveillance feed tick forward second by second, feeling a strange, hollow calm settle deeply into my chest. I had spent 40 years building a life with Victoria, trusting her with my heart, my home, and my legacy. Now I was sitting in a parked car, waiting to watch her willingly walk into a slaughterhouse of her own making. At precisely 7 in the morning, the heavy wooden doors of my private study slowly pushed open. I held my breath, my eyes locked onto the small screen. Victoria stepped into the room first. She was wearing a silken robe, her hair perfectly styled, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Damian Pierce followed closely behind her, already dressed in a sharp tailored business suit, ready for another day of dismantling my empire. They moved with the arrogant, unhurried confidence of two people who firmly believed they owned the entire world. Victoria approached my mahogany desk. She paused, her eyes instantly catching the thick legal document I had left exposed in the center of the leather blotter. I watched the feed intensely as she set her coffee cup down with a sharp, sudden movement. She reached out and picked up the fabricated draft will. Even through the small screen of my phone, I could clearly see the sheer predatory hunger instantly illuminate her face. She eagerly scanned the dense legal paragraphs, her eyes darting back and forth across the heavy paper. Damian stepped up right behind her, leaning over her shoulder to read the document. The transformation in his posture was immediate and terrifying. The smooth, polished corporate executive vanished, replaced entirely by a ruthless, starving scavenger. He pointed a long, steady finger at the final clause, the specific paragraph, detailing the absolute controlling power of Caldwell Apex. I watched his lips move as he silently read the fabricated terms to Victoria. A massive, triumphant smile spread across her beautiful face. She looked up at Damian, her eyes shining with a greedy, victorious light that made my stomach churn. She believed they had finally found the master key to the kingdom. She believed the confused, declining old man had carelessly handed them the entire multi-billion-dollar fortune on a silver platter. She immediately pulled her personal smartphone from her robe pocket. Her fingers moved rapidly as she photographed every single page of the toxic document, capturing the deadly lies with desperate, frantic enthusiasm. When she finished photographing the final page, she carefully placed the document back onto the desk, meticulously positioning it exactly as I had left it. She turned to face Damian. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her tightly against his chest. Right there, standing over my desk, standing over the fake testament of my life, they kissed passionately. It was a deep, sickening celebration of their ultimate betrayal. They kissed like two conquerors, standing upon the ashes of a fallen kingdom, entirely oblivious to the lethal trap closing violently around their throats. I watched their vile, celebratory embrace for a long, silent moment, before firmly pressing the power button and turning the screen completely black. I rested my heavy head against the cool leather seat, closing my eyes. The final sliver of doubt, the last remaining ghost of my love for the woman I had married, completely evaporated into the cold morning air. They had taken the bait with absolute blinding greed. They had looked at the poisoned apple and saw only gold. They believed Caldwell Apex was the supreme holding company, granting them total legal immunity and unlimited wealth. They had absolutely no idea it was a radioactive wasteland heavily loaded with $500 million in toxic corporate debt, crushing federal tax liabilities, and the undeniable digital proof of a massive international money laundering syndicate. Tomorrow is my 70th birthday. A major board of directors meeting is scheduled. Victoria and Damian will attempt a hostile takeover, demanding I surrender control of Caldwell Apex to them. They will demand the poison, and I will gladly give it to them. The morning of my 70th birthday broke with a dull, heavy gray sky over the city of Chicago. I did not wake up with the quiet, reflective peace one might expect upon reaching such a significant milestone. I woke up with the cold, absolute clarity of an executioner. I dressed meticulously in my darkest, most severe bespoke suit, securing the knot of my silk tie with hands that did not possess even the slightest trace of a tremor. I placed Evelyn Sterling's encrypted drive into my inner pocket, feeling its heavy metallic weight against my chest, like a suit of armor. When my driver brought the town car to a halt outside the towering glass and steel architecture of Caldwell Logistics, I did not shuffle. I did not hesitate. I walked through the grand lobby with the exact same commanding, deeply dominant stride that had built this empire from nothing. The reception staff who had whispered about my supposed decline just 24 hours ago now scrambled out of my way, sensing the dangerous electric shift in my entire demeanor. I took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. The atmosphere in the outer offices was incredibly tense, completely suffocating under the weight of the impending board of directors meeting. The heavy oak doors to the primary conference room stood wide open, waiting for the final act of this vicious corporate play to commence. I walked in slowly and confidently, taking my rightful seat at the absolute head of the massive polished mahogany table, completely ready for a war. The board members filtered in slowly, taking their respective seats with nervous, uncomfortable energy. These were men and women I had known for decades. We had fought brutal corporate wars together, weathered massive economic recessions, and built a global shipping titan. Yet today, none of them could meet my eyes for more than a fleeting second. Damian Pierce had done his groundwork flawlessly. He had been quietly lobbying them for months, planting dark seeds of doubt about my cognitive stability, preparing them for a hostile transition of power. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open one final time. Victoria and Damian entered the room together. They did not walk. They glided. They wore impeccably tailored matching charcoal designer suits that silently radiated an aura of absolute untouchable victory. Victoria's posture was perfectly straight, her chin tilted upward with an arrogant, deeply entitled pride. Damian walked closely at her side, carrying a thick leather briefcase, his face set in a mask of grim determination that poorly hid the ravenous, greedy excitement shining in his dark eyes. They looked exactly like two conquering monarchs, stepping into a surrendered throne room. They took the two seats directly to my right, positioning themselves as my immediate successors. The entire room fell into a deathly suffocating silence. The air was so incredibly thick with tension that it felt difficult to pull oxygen into my lungs. I leaned forward, resting my forearms flat against the cool wood of the table. I will now call this quarterly board of directors meeting to official order. I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the vast room, completely devoid of the weak, trembling confusion I had so carefully feigned the day before. Before I could even finish my opening sentence, Damian Pierce stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. With all due respect, Harrison and Damian interrupted, his voice booming with a false, heavily manufactured sorrow that echoed off the glass walls. This board cannot in good conscience proceed with any standard operational business this morning. We are facing a severe, unprecedented crisis of corporate leadership. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, glancing nervously between Damian and myself. Damian reached into his dark leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila folder. With a sharp, theatrical gesture, he tossed the folder onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, heavy slap that made several executives physically flinch. That is a comprehensive, independently verified medical evaluation conducted by 3 leading neurological specialists, Damian announced, projecting his voice so every single person in the room could hear his devastating lies. It details a rapid, irreversible, and severely debilitating cognitive decline. Under Section 4 of our corporate bylaws concerning executive competency and medical incapacitation, It is my deeply painful duty to formally declare Harrison Caldwell entirely mentally unfit to continue serving as Chief Executive Officer of this corporation. A collective, horrified gasp rippled around the large table. The older director's men who had stood by my side for over 30 years stared at the medical folder with absolute shock. Before anyone could voice a single objection or demand further clarification, Victoria rose slowly from her seat. This was her moment, the grand performance she had spent months rehearsing. She raised a delicate, perfectly manicured hand to her face, a single masterful tear escaping her eye and rolling slowly down her cheek. She looked around the long table, meeting the gaze of every single board member with a look of profound, deeply agonizing heartbreak. "Please, you must understand how incredibly difficult this is for me, Victoria," whispered her voice, cracking with brilliant, flawless, emotional precision. "I love my husband more than anything in this world. I have spent the last 6 months watching the brilliant man I married slowly slip away into confusion and shadows. I have tried to hide his mistakes, tried to protect his dignity, but I can no longer allow his failing mind to jeopardize the livelihoods of the thousands of employees who depend on this company." She paused, wiping the fake tear away with a silk handkerchief. "I am doing this to protect my husband's legacy from his own decaying mind." She turned her gaze directly toward Damien, nodding slightly. Damien leaned firmly against the table, pressing his strategic advantage. "For the immediate preservation of Caldwell Logistics and to ensure global market stability, my team has prepared emergency transition documents," Damien stated smoothly. "These documents immediately transfer all executive proxy, including absolute unhindered operational control of the newly discovered highly concentrated holding entity known as Caldwell Apex, directly to myself and Victoria." I watched the greedy anticipation practically vibrating in his jaw. He truly wanted Caldwell Apex. He desperately wanted the extremely lethal poison. Damien offered a slow, incredibly vicious smirk, looking down at me as if I were already buried in the dirt. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the 2 massive corporate security guards standing by the main doors. "Escort Mr. Caldwell out of the building," Damien commanded coldly. "Escort him down to his waiting car so he can go home and rest quietly and peacefully." The 2 extremely large security guards stepped forward immediately, moving quickly toward the head of the heavy table to physically remove me from the empire I had built. I did not flinch or look away. I did not speak a single word of protest. I simply remained completely seated, my hands resting perfectly still upon the polished mahogany, calmly waiting for them to finally reach me and make their fatal mistake. The 2 massive corporate security guards closed the distance between the grand double doors and my heavy mahogany chair. I felt the heavy vibrating thud of their tactical boots against the polished hardwood floor, a steady drumbeat signaling my impending highly public execution. They reached my side, their large hands extending to grip my shoulders and physically haul me out of the very room I had built from the ground up over 40 long years. I did not resist their imposing presence. I simply looked up at Damien Pierce. The pure, unadulterated arrogance radiating from his sharp features was absolutely intoxicating to witness. He held up a single, perfectly manicured hand, gesturing firmly for the heavy guards to pause their advance. He wanted to savor this specific moment. He wanted to completely humiliate me in front of the entire corporate board before he threw me into the freezing street like common refuse. "Wait!" Damien commanded, his voice dripping with venomous, mocking sweetness that echoed off the thick glass walls of the silent boardroom. "Let the confused old man stay for just 1 more minute. I want him to fully understand exactly how his magnificent empire has finally evolved today." He turned his attention toward the massive digital display mounted on the far wall of the long room. He retrieved a small, sleek remote from his designer suit pocket and pressed a single button with a theatrical flourish. The massive screen flared to life, instantly illuminating the dim, incredibly tense room with a blinding, harsh white light. A heavily redacted, incredibly complex legal document appeared on the high-definition display. It was a formal declaration of corporate ownership bearing the official, undeniable seals of our international banking partners. The older directors sitting around the table leaned forward collectively, their eyes squinting in the bright light, as they frantically tried to decipher the dense, complicated legal phrasing projected before them. Damien began to pace slowly back and forth at the absolute head of the table, commanding the terrified room with the practiced, terrifying ease of a seasoned predator who had just successfully cornered his wounded prey. For the past decade, this incredible company has severely stagnated under the overly cautious, rapidly decaying leadership of a man who simply refuses to adapt to the modern global market. Damien announced, his voice echoing with absolute, unchecked authority. He pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at the glowing screen. But today, we officially turn the page toward a much brighter, infinitely more profitable future. I am incredibly proud to announce that effective as of 8 sharp this morning, Victoria and I have successfully executed a massive, completely hostile buyout of the core structural foundation of this entire logistics corporation. A loud collective murmur of profound, undisguised shock rippled through the seated board members. Damien raised his voice effortlessly, silencing them instantly with a single sharp glare. He swiped to the next page of the digital presentation, revealing a flawlessly forged, legally binding bill of sale that made my heart race with anticipation. Utilizing our own private, completely independent wealth, Victoria and I have officially acquired exactly 51% of the absolute controlling stake in Caldwell Apex, Damien declared proudly. We are now the legal, undisputed majority owners of the entire Caldwell legacy. I sat perfectly still, listening to him openly admit his massive crime in front of 20 silent witnesses. I knew exactly where that private, independent wealth had actually come from. He had ruthlessly drained my charitable foundation, washing millions of dollars through my daughter using her digital signature, completely convinced he had outsmarted the entire federal government. He had eagerly taken those toxic, highly illegal funds and wired them directly into the trap Bradley Harmon had carefully constructed in Geneva. Damien honestly believed he had just legally purchased the crown jewel of my financial empire. He had absolutely no idea he had just officially purchased $500 million in toxic corporate debt, crushing federal tax liabilities, and the undeniable digital proof of his own massive international money laundering syndicate. The massive boardroom instantly erupted into absolute unmitigated chaos. Several senior directors jumped aggressively out of their expensive leather chairs, shouting desperate demands for immediate legal clarification and violently slamming their shaking hands against the polished mahogany table. They were completely terrified, realizing that the entire power dynamic of their wealthy, secure lives had just been violently overthrown without a single prior warning. The room devolved into a deafening chorus of panicked voices and desperate shouted questions. Through the sheer terrifying noise, I looked calmly across the long table at my treacherous wife. Victoria sat there happily bathing in the glorious, chaotic noise, a smug, highly satisfied smile playing softly on her bright red lips. She slowly reached out across the table and gently placed her delicate hand over his hand, intertwining their fingers for the entire shocked room to witness clearly. It was a blatant, sickening public display of their deeply treacherous, highly illegal alliance. She looked directly into my eyes, her expression radiating a cold, victorious cruelty that confirmed every dark suspicion I had ever harbored about her true malicious nature. I watched her enjoy the destruction of my legacy. I watched her bask in the stolen glory. She felt entirely untouchable, completely insulated by the stolen millions she had successfully washed through the charity foundation. She honestly believed that she was finally free from my shadow. Damien let the terrified, deafening shouting continue. For a few agonizing moments, relishing the absolute panic he had successfully orchestrated. Then he violently slammed his heavy fist down onto the thick table. The sharp, explosive sound instantly silenced the panicked executives, forcing them to drop back into their seats in fearful submission. The transaction is entirely complete and absolutely irreversible. Damien roared, his dark eyes flashing with absolute unchecked power. The legal documents have been officially filed, completely certified, and officially recorded by federal banking authorities in Europe. I now hold the supreme executive proxy. You all answer exclusively to me now. He turned his full arrogant attention back to where I sat, his lip curling into a vicious, deeply satisfied sneer that exposed his pure, unadulterated greed. And my very first official act as the absolute majority owner of this global corporation is to permanently remove the decaying rot from this executive office. He looked directly at the two massive security guards who were still hovering closely behind my chair, waiting for his final command. "Get this pathetic, broken old man out of my sight right now," Damien commanded coldly. "Escort him out of my building." The guards stepped forward once again, their heavy hands gripping my suit. I did not struggle. I simply inhaled a calm breath of the tense, suffocating boardroom air. I gently shook my tired head, signaling the large security guards to pause for a second. I raised my hands and slowly took off my glasses. I placed them gently on the polished wood of the table. I looked directly at Victoria, my voice dead silent. "You bought 51% of Apex. Are you absolutely sure the ink is dry?" Victoria sneers. "It is." "You're finished, Harrison." I did not blink, as her poisonous words hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom. I let out a low, steady breath. I raised my hands slowly from the polished mahogany table. Then I brought my palms together. I clapped twice. The sound was sharp, incredibly loud, and completely out of place in the tense silence of the room. It was a definitive, lethal command. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom were pushed wide with a forceful, unified momentum that instantly shattered the illusion of Damian Pierce's control. My chief legal counsel, Bradley Harmon, strode into the room first, his face set in a mask of unrelenting stone. Right beside him walked my eldest son, Preston, his posture radiating quiet dignity. Trailing immediately behind them, moving with tactical precision, was a squad of 6 heavily armed federal agents from the FBI. Their hands rested instinctively on their belts. The boardroom instantly descended into paralyzed shock. The older directors who had been shouting just moments ago completely froze in their leather chairs. The 2 massive corporate security guards who had been ordered to remove me took one look at the advancing federal squad and immediately stepped back against the glass walls in total surrender. I finally stood up. I picked up my glasses and slid them back onto my face, bringing the terrified expressions of my treacherous wife and her ambitious lover into sharp focus. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, securely folded document. It was the authentic, completely unfiltered financial manifest of the newly formed holding company. I tossed it effortlessly down the long table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a halt right in front of Damien's trembling hands. "Congratulations, Damien," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, devastating authority. "Congratulations, Victoria. You just spent $50 million of stolen offshore money to successfully purchase the absolute majority ownership of Caldwell Apex. You both fought so incredibly hard for the crown jewel of my empire, but you failed to look inside the velvet box." Damien stared at the authentic manifest, his dark eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as his rapid mind finally began to process the catastrophic numbers printed on the page. "Caldwell Apex is not a holding company for my liquid assets," I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced every person in the room to lean forward and listen. "Caldwell Apex is a corporate garbage can. It is a highly toxic radioactive vault designed specifically for you. You just bought yourselves exactly $500 million in severely underperforming, utterly toxic commercial debt. You purchased massive pending federal tax audits that will instantly bankrupt you. And most importantly, you purchased the exclusive legal liability for a sprawling international money laundering syndicate that is currently under active, aggressive federal investigation for massive wire fraud. Victoria's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly white. She looked frantically from the document to my face, her perfect facade crumbling into pure desperation. "Harrison," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "What have you done? What does this mean? We own the company. We bought the assets." Bradley Harmon stepped forward, placing his heavy leather briefcase on the table next to the frozen security guards. He looked at Victoria with absolute unrestrained professional disgust. "It means you bought the poison," Victoria Bradley explained methodically, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "By signing those legally binding acquisition documents this morning, you and Damien explicitly utilized the stolen funds from your daughter's charity foundation. You believed you were cleverly washing that dirty money into legitimate corporate equity. Instead, you legally assumed all primary criminal and financial liability for every single fraudulent shell company in the entire syndicate. You severed the legal tether connecting those illegal offshore transfers to Valerie. You tied the federal noose directly around your own greedy necks. You just bought your own federal prison sentences." Preston stepped up beside me, his steady presence a comforting anchor in the center of the storm. He looked at Damien, who was now visibly hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his custom designer suit. "You thought my father was a confused old man," Preston said, his voice ringing with absolute fierce loyalty. "You thought you could blind him with a fake medical diagnosis and steal his legacy. But he built this empire from nothing. He knows every single shadow in this building. You never stood a chance." The overwhelming reality of his absolute destruction finally crashed down onto Damien Pierce. His arrogant posture collapsed. He looked at the federal agents fanning out across the boardroom. He looked at the thick stack of financial evidence proving his direct, undeniable guilt. The cornered predator instinct took over. Damien violently shoved his heavy leather chair backward, sending it crashing to the floor. He spun around desperately, sprinting toward the side exit door. He did not make it 3 steps. The lead federal agent moved with terrifying speed, intercepting Damien before he could even reach the brass handle. The agent grabbed Damien by the shoulder of his expensive suit and violently slammed him face first against the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The heavy impact rattled the entire room. Damien groaned in pain, sliding down the glass as the agent swiftly pinned his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing loudly in the silent room. "You are under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, and criminal conspiracy." The agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising bark. Victoria watched her young, ruthless lover get forcefully restrained against the glass. The illusion of her grand, wealthy future completely shattered into millions of jagged, painful pieces. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream of sheer, unadulterated panic. She stumbled backward, bumping into the large digital display that was still proudly proclaiming her fraudulent victory. "Harrison, please," she sobbed hysterically, reaching her trembling hands out toward me. I was confused. Damien manipulated me. He made me do it. I never wanted to hurt Valerie. You have to believe me. Please tell them to stop. I looked at the woman I had loved for 40 years, the woman who had happily served up our innocent daughter to federal prosecutors, just to fund her twisted, greedy fantasies. I truly felt absolutely nothing for her. The love was dead, completely replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of protective fury. 2 female federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Victoria firmly by the arms. She thrashed and screamed, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor as they forced her wrists into cold steel cuffs. I stood proudly beside my loyal son and my brilliant lawyer, quietly watching the absolute destruction of my treacherous enemies unfold with perfect poetic justice right before my eyes. The massive corporate war was finally over. I had successfully protected my beloved daughter from a devastating fate, secured my sprawling international shipping legacy, and completely eradicated the vile parasites feeding on my family. The proud, unyielding king had finally returned to his rightful throne. I did not blink as her poisonous words hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom. I let out a low, steady breath. I raised my hands slowly from the polished mahogany table. Then I brought my palms together. I clapped twice. The sound was sharp, incredibly loud, and completely out of place in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. It was a definitive, lethal command. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom were pushed wide open with a forceful, unified momentum that instantly shattered the fragile illusion of Damian Pierce's control. My chief legal counsel, Bradley Harmon, strode into the room first, his face set in a mask of unrelenting stone. Right beside him walked my eldest son, Preston, his posture radiating quiet, unshakable dignity. Trailing immediately behind them, moving with terrifying tactical precision, was a squad of 6 heavily armed federal agents from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Their hands rested instinctively on their utility belts, their eyes scanning the room with absolute authority. The boardroom instantly descended into paralyzed shock. The older directors, who had been shouting just moments ago, completely froze in their leather chairs, their mouths hanging open. The 2 massive corporate security guards, who had been ordered to remove me, took one look at the advancing federal squad and immediately stepped back against the glass walls in total surrender, raising their empty hands. I finally stood up. I picked up my glasses and slid them back onto my face, bringing the terrified, bloodless expressions of my treacherous wife and her ambitious lover into sharp focus. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, securely folded document. It was the authentic, completely unfiltered financial manifest of the newly formed holding company. I tossed it effortlessly down the long table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a halt right in front of Damian's trembling hands. "Congratulations, Damian," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, devastating authority. "Congratulations, Victoria. You just spent $50 million of stolen offshore money to successfully purchase the absolute majority ownership of Caldwell Apex. You both fought so incredibly hard for the crown jewel of my empire. But you failed to look inside the velvet box." Damian stared at the authentic manifest, his dark eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as his rapid mind finally began to process the catastrophic numbers printed clearly on the page. "Caldwell Apex is not a holding company for my liquid assets." I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced every person in the room to lean forward and listen. "Caldwell Apex is a corporate garbage can. It is a highly toxic, radioactive vault designed specifically for you. You just bought yourselves exactly $500 million in severely underperforming, utterly toxic commercial debt. You purchased massive pending federal tax audits that will instantly bankrupt you. And most importantly, you purchased the exclusive legal liability for a sprawling international money laundering syndicate that is currently under active, aggressive federal investigation for massive wire fraud." Victoria's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, ghostly white. She looked frantically from the document to my face, her perfect facade crumbling into pure desperation. "Harrison," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "What have you done? What does this mean?" "We own the company. We bought the assets." Bradley Harmon stepped forward, placing his heavy leather briefcase on the table next to the frozen security guards. He looked at Victoria with absolute unrestrained professional disgust. "It means you bought the poison," Victoria Bradley explained methodically, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "By signing those legally binding acquisition documents this morning, you and Damian explicitly utilized the stolen funds from your daughter's charity foundation. You believed you were cleverly washing that dirty money into legitimate corporate equity. Instead, you legally assumed all primary criminal and financial liability for every single fraudulent shell company in the entire syndicate. You severed the legal tether connecting those illegal offshore transfers to Valerie. You tied the federal noose directly around your own greedy necks. You just bought your own federal prison sentences." Preston stepped up beside me, his steady presence a comforting anchor in the center of the storm. He looked at Damian, who was now visibly hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his custom designer suit. You thought my father was a confused old man, Preston said, his voice ringing with absolute fierce loyalty. You thought you could blind him with a fake medical diagnosis and steal his legacy. But he built this empire from nothing. He knows every single shadow in this building. You never stood a chance. The overwhelming reality of his absolute destruction finally crashed down onto Damian Pierce. His arrogant posture collapsed completely. He looked at the federal agents fanning out across the boardroom. He looked at the thick stack of financial evidence proving his direct, undeniable guilt. The cornered predator instinct took over. Damian violently shoved his heavy leather chair backward, sending it crashing to the floor. He spun around desperately, sprinting toward the side exit door. He did not make it 3 steps. The lead federal agent moved with terrifying speed, intercepting Damian before he could even reach the brass handle. The agent grabbed Damian by the shoulder of his expensive suit and violently slammed him face first against the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The heavy impact rattled the entire room. Damian groaned in pain, sliding down the glass as the agent swiftly pinned his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing loudly in the silent room. You are under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, and criminal conspiracy, the agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising bark. Victoria watched her young, ruthless lover get forcefully restrained against the glass. The illusion of her grand, wealthy future completely shattered into millions of jagged, painful pieces. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream of sheer, unadulterated panic. The majestic, untouchable queen of Chicago high society was reduced to a weeping, trembling shell. She collapsed onto her hands and knees, ignoring the stern warnings of the agents standing nearby. She crawled forward across the polished floor, reaching out with desperate hands to tightly grab the impeccably pressed fabric of my trousers. "Harrison, please," she wailed, her voice echoing shrilly against the mahogany walls. "You cannot do this to me. We have been married for 35 years. 35 years of my life, Harrison. I gave you my youth. I gave you everything. I was foolish. I was led astray by a younger man who poisoned my mind. But I am still your wife. You know the real me. You know I love you. Please, I am begging you, tell them this is a mistake. Tell them I had no idea about the money laundering. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave the house. Just do not let them put me in a cage." I looked down at her, clutching my legs. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no lingering affection, and certainly no mercy. I slowly reached down and firmly detached her gripping fingers from my clothing, prying her hands away with deliberate strength. I took a step back, severing the physical connection between us forever. I reached into my inner suit pocket and withdrew the cheap, hastily purchased $50 silk tie she had carelessly tossed at me on our last anniversary. I held the cheap fabric up before dropping it slowly. It fluttered downward, landing directly on her tear-stained face. "Your performance was excellent, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping to a dead mechanical whisper that carried no human warmth. "But the theater is closed. You did not just betray my trust. You actively framed our only daughter for a massive federal crime. That is evil, and evil must be locked away." She let out a guttural scream as 2 female federal agents stepped forward, gripping her arms firmly and lifting her forcefully from the floor. She thrashed and kicked, her wails echoing down the empty corridors as they dragged her away to face the absolute devastation of her own choices. The room finally fell silent. I turned to the lead agent and picked up a separate, heavily protected leather folder from my desk. I handed the thick stack of original unredacted documents directly to him. "This is the complete forensic digital audit," I explained. "It contains the undeniable encrypted server logs proving that Damian and Victoria actively utilized unauthorized access to manipulate my daughter's digital signature. These logs unequivocally demonstrate that Valerie Caldwell had absolutely zero knowledge regarding the illicit offshore transfers." As the agent accepted the proof, the side door opened quietly. Valerie stepped into the room. She looked exhausted, having lived under the terrifying shadow of a looming federal indictment. She looked at the empty boardroom, the scattered chairs, and the remaining federal agents. I offered her a soft, reassuring smile. "It is over, sweetheart," I said gently. "You are completely safe. The authorities have the real criminals. Your name is entirely cleared." Valerie let out a broken, shuddering gasp. She ran across the room and threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder as she began to cry. "Dad," she whispered through her heavy sobs. "I saw them taking Mom away in handcuffs. How could she do this to us?" I rubbed her back soothingly. She let her greed consume her humanity. "Valerie," I replied quietly. "She became a monster. But monsters only thrive in the dark. Once you drag them into the blinding light, they burn." 6 months passed, bringing a sweeping, violent, and utterly necessary cleansing to the Caldwell corporate empire. The federal trials were incredibly swift and brutally public. Damian Pierce, stripped of his arrogant bravado and facing a mountain of undeniable forensic evidence, attempted to negotiate a plea deal by throwing Victoria entirely under the bus. His cowardly tactics completely failed. The federal judge, absolutely disgusted by the sheer magnitude of his international money laundering syndicate, handed Damian a crushing, unyielding sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Victoria's spectacular downfall was equally devastating. During the highly publicized divorce proceedings, my legal team meticulously dismantled her remaining assets, leaving her absolutely penniless. Facing the undeniable proof of her conspiracy to frame her own daughter, the judge showed zero leniency. She was sentenced to 7 grueling years behind bars. In the wake of their destruction, Caldwell Logistics experienced a monumental historic rebirth. I officially stepped down from my position as Chief Executive Officer. Preston, who had proven his absolute loyalty and brilliant strategic mind during the darkest hours of the crisis, was unanimously appointed as the new CEO. Under his steady ethical leadership, the company was completely restructured and cleansed of the toxic liabilities. Valerie's charitable foundation flourished, heavily endowed with clean, legitimate corporate funding, completely erasing the stain of Victoria's corruption. I stood alone at the edge of the sprawling Chicago commercial docks, feeling the bitter, howling wind whipping off Lake Michigan. The icy air bit at my face, but I found the harshness incredibly invigorating. I held 2 steaming cups of dark, bitter coffee in my gloved hands. I watched the massive, towering cargo ships slowly loading their heavy containers, the mechanical hum of the massive cranes echoing across the busy port. This was the beating heart of my empire, the physical manifestation of 40 years of blood, sweat, and absolute dedication. I heard the quiet, steady crunch of footsteps approaching on the gravel behind me. Evelyn Sterling walked up to the edge of the pier, pulling the collar of her heavy wool coat tightly against the freezing wind. She accepted the hot coffee I offered, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the massive logistics operation unfolding before us. "It is a beautiful operation," Harris and Evelyn said quietly, taking a slow sip of the steaming coffee. "Preston is running the European divisions with incredible efficiency. The shadow networks are completely dismantled. The company is stronger than it has ever been in a decade. You played an incredibly dangerous game, but you won the entire board." I looked out at the dark, churning water, watching a massive freighter slowly pull away from the dock, heading out into the vast, open expanse. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle into my bones, a quiet satisfaction that only comes from surviving a fatal storm. "They think an old lion loses his teeth," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. "They forget. An old lion survives because he knows exactly how to make the hyenas walk into their own slaughter. Betrayal from those closest to you is the most intoxicating poison, for it comes wrapped in the guise of love and concern. The greatest defense a man can have is not eternal paranoia, but the absolute clarity of mind to recognize a lie when it is spoken. Never allow emotion to dictate your response to treason. When attacked, do not react with noise or immediate fury. Silence is the ultimate weapon. Document the truth, secure your assets, and restructure the battlefield so that the greed of your enemies becomes the very mechanism of their inevitable downfall. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to realize they were playing a game behind your back? How did you handle the ultimate betrayal? Drop your story in the comments below, hit that subscribe button for more tales of calculated justice, and remember, always watch your back.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every